My dad, he was proud to work there. My uncle, all my family was proud to work there, you know, and I was proud to work there. It was a good place to work. You made a good living there.
The Last Independent Automaker Podcast was sponsored in part by Visit Detroit, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Motor City's National Heritage Area, and by the over 375 individuals and organizations who donated to this project. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Last Independent Automaker Podcast. Now, today's episode is kind of special because there's no guests, there's no interviews, and Jim and Pat, my co-producers, aren't even here. But before you run away, I want to tell you we're doing something pretty neat. We're going to take some time to go through interviews from some of the people who, unfortunately, did not make it into the final cut of the film. If you followed us on Facebook, you know that we interviewed dozens of people for this project. I think, actually, the final count was like 50 or 51 or something. I don't remember exactly. But only about 35 interviews made it into the final documentary. So because of that, we have a lot of great stories that sadly just didn't make it into the final cut. And it wasn't for anything personal or political. It's just simply that we were limited to 3 hours and we had to cram a lot of information into those 3 hours. And so simply by necessity, we just couldn't fit every single person we interviewed into the documentary. But these people were still very generous with their time and let us interview them and share their stories. And so I want to recognize them for what they did for our project and give a chance for you, the viewer, to see some clips of these interesting folks we had the chance to talk to. And I think we might as well just jump right into it. So first up, I'd like to recognize John Sgalia. And he was a designer at American Motors and Jeep. He joined the company in the mid-70s. I don't remember exactly when. But John was an interesting guy. He was a friend of Vince Geraci and, Frank Pasco and some of the other AMC design styling people. And John shared some interesting stories with us. One thing he talked about, which we did mention in the documentary, is just how AMC became a champion at sharing parts between different models. And I mean, that goes way back to even the Nash years and the Rambler years. But American Motors, especially with cars like the Hornet and even the Javelin and AMX, were really good at sharing parts. And so here's a clip where John kind of describes the genius of that.
Well, we used a lot of shared parts, right? At least in terms of the instrument panels were shared between the junior cars, throughout the junior cars and the senior cars as well, were different designs, but shared pieces. And you got to, I'll say, quote, decorate them differently with different materials, different levels of cost and different levels of value. I never had the impression that we were trying to be super cheap. We're just trying to be smart. And in today's world, I think that probably, they may have been before their time, because when everyone else was sort of creating a new part just because they could, AMC was trying to watch its funds and use everything as smart as they could.
I still think it's fascinating that if you look at a first generation Javelin and a second generation Javelin, the layman might never realize that they use the exact same doors. I certainly didn't. And I think it's really neat that it's totally an AMC thing to do. Restyle the whole car, keep the door stampings because, that costs extra money and they're trying to save a buck. Another thing John said, we talked to him and a lot of stylists about how, government regulations affected their work. And if you watch our documentary, especially in the Pacer episode, Dave Perrine, who's an engineer, talks about how, emissions regulations and all this stuff made his work more complicated because they had all these rules they had to meet. And I think John Sgalia provided an interesting perspective when I asked him about, there's a lot of people who complain that government regulations made cars ugly. You had to have big bumpers and safety this and safety that. And it limited what stylists were able to do artistically because they had to meet safety laws. But John had an interesting perspective on that when he realized that his work was more than just about style. There was really a human element to it too.
Someone asked me to help them pick up a car at a dealership. And I was at the dealership, and there was a wrecked Hornet there, and it was gruesome inside. And you could see that someone had really was seriously injured in it. And then kind of from that, it just well, geez, these aren't just sculptures. These aren't these components, these armrests, these steering wheels and instrument panels aren't just there for looks. So it kind of brought to my mind the importance of having a friendly / safe interior. Now, how did regulations change? Obviously, we used to have hard knobs on radios and heater controls and things like that. And then as time went on, we had to put radii. Those knobs had to be soft. They had a certain deflection that they had to give when a knee or a head form hit. And as time went on, that continued and continued. And for the most part, in more towards the middle and the end of my career, we were meeting European homologation regulations, which were pretty strict in terms of what radiuses you could use, what amount of deformity or surface deformity, what level of energy had to be absorbed. And it became basically a science of a book of rules that you, after a while, instinctively knew that you weren't going to put a hard edge where someone's head might impact.
Did that affect, was there any kind of grumbling about that, or did you guys just take it the way it was?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I think there may have been grumbling had I been maybe 10 years older and more seasoned. As a new kid, it was just something you worked around. My very first assignment was to design a door lock knob, the little plunger type, and that was like my claim to fame, my first quote production part. Well, that in the past, I did a quick benchmark survey, see what was out there, but this knob had to have the homologation, the right amount of radius, and for safety reasons. So I got to design around it relatively early. So I didn't find it offensive. It was just something to work around. Sometimes when you have a regulation or a requirement, it gives you something to work around as opposed to just kind of creating blue sky. And, I find those kind of problems not so daunting.
I think that was a turning point for me as a producer to hear that story, because I think as an old car enthusiast, you think all government regulations are bad and that, all just ruined cars. They call the 70s the malaise era for a reason. But I think John helped me see that sometimes there is a higher purpose to the work, and it's not just about making a car that looks good. It's making a car that, if God forbid you do get into an accident, you can walk away from it. Now, the next person I'd like to focus on is a gentleman named Richard Ray. And Rich Ray was interesting in that he worked in product planning and marketing, which sound like two very different fields, but there's a lot of crossover in that because, product planning, it's, well, how can we make a something that people will buy? And marketing is, well, how can we convince people to buy it? And that's an oversimplification, but it's understanding what consumers want. Rich Ray talked about the first time he saw the car that would become the Renault Alliance, the French R9. And he talks about seeing that car and then having Renault, who at the time owned part of AMC, Renault wanting him to forecast, well, how many of these could you sell in America? And really kind of put the screws to him to come up with an answer. And so here's the story of that.
Well, in the Renault Alliance, I was in marketing at that point. And so I was over in France with some colleagues to visit Renault, and that's when they first proposed that we do that vehicle. And that was part of the reason we went over there. And so they spent the morning talking about and describing the vehicle and dimensions and, what segment it would be in and the capabilities, the horsepower and all the kind of features of the car. And then they said, well, how many can we sell? Or how many can you sell in the United States? And I said, well, I don't know. And can I see it first? And they said, well, okay. So after lunch, they took us to the design studios and we saw the clay models of their version for the European market. And they were insisting on a forecast. So myself and my two colleagues spent overnight in the hotel, going through what the industry was going to do and all the segments and everything, and came up with a forecast of 105,000 units, which amazingly survived all the years or several years of then development and analysis and program approvals and all those kind of things, and actually turned out to be the right number for the first year, but for all the wrong reasons because the segments changed. But So I got lucky that time. Well, I thought it was a very modern car. I think we thought it would do really well. We were quite pleased with it. I mean, there was things about the European version that wouldn't appeal to an American, but and we had the flexibility to change those things because it was the basic architecture of the car we're using, and fenders and grills and bumpers had to be different for U.S. safety standards, and a lot of the interior had to change to meet U.S. safety requirements and so forth. So we knew we had the flexibility to tweak the things that we didn't think would suit the U.S. market, but actually it worked out. We had a lot of good flexibility in that respect.
Another great story that Rich Ray told us was when he was in marketing, Jeep was really pushing Quadra-Track as a sales, I guess, an advertising thing to focus on. At least Jeep guys will argue that it was better than the competition, especially when you look at, Chevy and Ford. And so part of Rich Ray's job was to create this marketing material around how Jeep had the best traction system out there. But as it turns out, you can't just say that. You actually have to prove that for fear that you might get sued. And so here's Rich explaining how they had to go about proving that before they could actually advertise that.
At the time, they were pushing the Jeep Quadra-Track four-wheel drive transfer case. So part of one of my first major projects was developing the claim that we had the best four-wheel drive traction in the industry. Well, we hired Henry Hodges at the Nevada Automotive Test Center, which guy out in Nevada. He's long gone now, but the company's still there. They were quite knowledgeable in four-wheel drive capability. So we provide them with a fleet of a GM product, a Ford product, and our own Jeep Quadra-Track. And they performed all kinds of tests to come up to prove this conclusion. And it was kind of fascinating because I was bouncing between the lawyers, and they'd say, well, you have to do more in this area, and what it would take to get it through. And plus, we were even fighting weather because it's getting into springtime, and for ice, they had to have high altitudes. But even then, Henry would call me, and he'd say, we got a delay here, but he said, the ice at the 9,000 feet is melting, so we got to get going here. So it was fun. Yeah, we got the claim through, and we did commercials, and that became another part of the project was advertising types that want to push the envelope farther than what we had already been able to prove.
As I mentioned earlier, a big part of episode 4, right, that's the Pacer episode, a big part of episode 4 talks about how government regulations affected the auto industry. And we talked a little bit about that with styling, but of course, emissions were also a huge thing. As you know from watching episode 4, it was all about air pollution and gas mileage and blah, 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 blah. And they had to EPA test cars, and it was a whole thing. Well, this gentleman, Tom Jettie, who's our next guy I want to focus on, he was an electrical engineer, and he talked about how passing emissions were a huge priority for the automakers because without that, you can't sell cars. And so here's a clip that unfortunately we had to cut that I think really sheds some light into how big of a deal passing the emission tests were.
It was really difficult during the 70s to meet emissions, and so if you worked on anything emission related, you almost had an unlimited budget. You could work any hours. And one year I worked on Easter Sunday just to complete things. But the rest of the economy, if you look at that time period, people were being laid off. But anything emission related, just to make sure the products can be sold and they pass all the emissions. They used to drive the cars around a test track for 50,000 miles, and so that would take a couple months to do that. And if something happened towards the end of the test, you'd have to start all over again. And you couldn't sell that combination. You couldn't sell a V8 with a manual trans or whatever it was that didn't pass. So they'd recalibrate it. And so emissions were a big thing in the early days. Now they seem to be pretty good, other than we're always flashing modules anymore to change the software.
As I mentioned, Tom Jettie was an electrical engineer, and he worked at Ford and then later worked at American Motors and, of course, worked on Jeep projects. And one of those things he worked on was the Jeep XJ. His job, he ended up getting stuck with working on the horn, which, you don't think of a horn as that important, but cars have to have horns. It's kind of a thing. And, most people don't think about how important the horn is until you find yourself in a situation where you need to use it. And you're like, oh, yeah, I guess that is important. So Tom was responsible for the horn on the Jeep XJ, and here he explains some of the challenges of being in charge of packaging something and how you can find room to put it when you've got all these other components going on under the hood at the same time.
At that time, be electromechanical. Horns were always a component that nobody wanted or nobody took responsibility for. So that they said that's electromechanical. So horns are yours too. So I had my horns right behind that grill, and had to make sure you always had clearance between your part and the grill. But it was a thankless job. You took up a lot of space wherever you packaged them, wherever you located them in the engine compartment or in the front or on the bumper or whatever. They had to be certified for Europe. They had to be homologated. You had to have a certain dB level for the European requirements, the EEC and ECE requirements. So we went to Ohio you had to have a big flat parking lot with nothing else in it, and you set up a sound level meter, and you had your dBs and the requirements. But horns were something that usually people in the engine compartment that had washer reservoirs or any other component vacuum canister, just move your horns out of the way. You have to get in early, and you have to, stake your ground and say, I need this part for horns, or I need to have a trough in the metal for wiring, or you need to get in early and you need to say what you need and get it.
Like many AMC employees, Tom stuck around after Chrysler bought American Motors and ended up working for Chrysler for years. And while this is technically not an AMC story, this little anecdote of his I thought was very funny and also probably frustrating to him. And so I thought it was worth sharing. Here's a story from Tom when he talked about working on the Jeep Liberty, which, if you remember, the original Jeep Liberty had the window switches on the center console, not on the doors. And that's kind of a European thing. That was during the Daimler Chrysler era. So I'm sure there was some pressure to, do the center window switches or whatever. But it turns out that Americans don't like having window switches on the center console. And here's his story about the problems that created.
These were probably 2 or 3 years before the Jeep came out. And we all sat down and we all came to an agreement that locating the power window switches on the center console was a good idea. It was from electrical standpoint. I didn't have to have 2 sets of switches on each door. I just had 1 set of switches on a console. And wiring-wise, I didn't have to string wiring all over the vehicle. So we had everything on the center console. We had Corvette, and I think there were other couple vehicles that had switches on the console. Well, when the vehicle came out and the public kept reaching to the door to put the windows down, the Jettie powered numbers and the feedback from the general public was, this is not a good idea, we need to change it. Well, everything had already been done, and we went back and investigated how much it would be to move the switches from the console to the doors, and most of it was body engineering, was $1 million to do that. So it was very, very expensive to do. So money always factored into changes.
Now, I have to say, 2 of the nicest people who unfortunately did not make it into the final documentary were Mary Ann Moran and Celia Stankorb. And these 2 ladies were just the nicest. They invited me to come interview them at one of their homes. They provided cake and coffee, and they were just so cheerful and fun. And I'm really sad that their stories didn't make it into the documentary. It's just unfortunate that their time at American Motors happened to be mostly during episodes 5 and 6. And those 2 episodes were just crammed with information and stories about Renault and the Eagle and the Jeeps and the gas crisis and all this stuff going on. And sadly, we just couldn't fit some of their stories in there. But they were interesting in that they worked as analysts and secretaries and held various different jobs over the years. And one of the interesting part of their stories is that they were starting out their careers right around the same time that personal computers were kind of becoming a thing in the workplace. And there's a particular brand of computer, I had to look it up, I'd never heard of it. It was called the Wang. And it was used for mostly word processing and office work and that kind of thing. And so, somebody says, it's the Wang computer. So, right up there with IBM and Commodore used to be the Wang. Again, they went out of business. I haven't heard of them, But anyways, Mary Ann actually held on to one of the giant floppy disks that was used when she was working on the Wang computer. And so here's a story about Mary Ann and Celia talking about the interesting issues that came with, being PC users in the 1980s.
And that was the Wang computer, and this was what the disk looked like. Yeah, and it would be just like a disk or a flash drive or whatever we have now on the computers. That's what's on here. Only this is what it looked like. And then it went to the smaller discs, like a CD disc, of course, but this was like 1979. And everybody was always worried about if you sat at that computer, what's going to happen to your vision? And it was like, you'd have I think it was a colored, some sort of a thing you put over the screen even to protect your eyes, right? Because, everybody, it was so new, you didn't know what you were doing to your eyes.
Programs would crash, but then there was always a good IT person that you would call and say, I can't get this program to run. And then they would come and look at everything, and then they would get you going again. But until that person came, you were just like, you didn't know what to do.
Of course, another thing we talk to a lot of AMC employees about is that, what kind of cars did you drive? And it's always fun when somebody talks about, I worked for AMC and I drove a Javelin or a Matador or whatever. And so here's a clip from Marianne and Celia talking about what kind of AMCs they drove over the years.
My daughter bought a Alliance, and she could not drive a stick shift, but she bought a stick. And my husband would take her to drive, and she would come home crying. So she had a Renault.
AMC, when I was working there, because you got a discount as an employee, and it was a good way for me to purchase a vehicle. So ever since I started buying the Alliance, I went on up to all the different products that they've made. So I've been very happy with them.
Again, I have to thank Celia and Marianne for their kindness. So many of the people we interviewed opened their homes to us, and we're dragging in cameras and plugging things in and tearing apart their living room and putting up lights. And so many people, just like them, were so kind. They'd give us snacks, they'd offer us coffee, they'd buy us lunch sometimes. I mean, our team was so incredibly lucky that the AMC community is full of so many generous people. So far, all the people we've talked about were folks who worked at AMC's headquarters in Detroit, whether that was the headquarters on Plymouth Road or the other headquarters in Southfield. Those were all people who worked white-collar office jobs. Now let's switch to Kenosha, which not only had blue-collar jobs on the assembly line, but also had a lot of office jobs. I mean, there were people who needed to do scheduling and planning and human resources and accounting and whatever. And so there were hundreds of office employees that supported the factory operations. And so one of the first Kenosha people I'd like to talk about was Minne Cox-Laudonio. Now, she, I think, worked in the factory a little bit, but then primarily worked in the office, worked a couple different jobs. But it was interesting, she was friends with Al Aceto. And so if you remember him from, I think, episode 2, he talked about being a factory employee who then transitioned to being a white-collar employee, and how he still stayed in touch with all of his buddies who still worked in the plant. And some of his management on the white collar side kind of looked down their noses at him. He'd go to work in a suit and tie, and then he'd go out drinking with his factory buddies. And so, there was always a little bit of tension there. She echoed something that Al said, which was that the ethnicities of workers could sometimes become a point of pride, but also a point of contention, especially when it came to the management of AMC's Lakefront plant.
All the Italians moved down there. The guy that was general foreman, the superintendent, he just hired all his buddies. There were like 9 foremen and general foreman and the superintendent. They were all Italian. But it was fine,
Now, Minne shared another story with me that I thought was kind of funny, but also kind of eye-opening. She mentioned that she was the only woman in her group or her division or whatever, which was like, dozens of men, and then she was the only woman. And, I kind of rather naively asked her, well, were there any issues? You think, is this like a Mad Men type environment, where, the guys are hitting on the secretaries and stirring up trouble? And Minne told me that her issue wasn't necessarily with the men in the office, but some of the women, like Celia and Marianne. Minne happened to be working in the office around the time that computers were revolutionizing the workplace. And as it turned out, that actually was a good thing for her.
There were 3 material handling receiving offices throughout the plant. And one of them had 2 women in it. And they fought so bad. It was better having just one. In the other office, there was only one, and in my office, there was only one. It was really better just having one. Where there were two, the one woman is older, and so she just did what she wanted to do, and she made the other one do what she didn't like to do, you know. And it wasn't a good situation. And then when we got computers, the older one got so scared of computers, she retired. She was about 62 then. Computers were wonderful, you know. We'd get the packing list and we'd see that it was all on the screen, what was on the packing list that we got from the dock, and we just had to enter, and it did the whole thing, you know. She wouldn't have needed to be so scared at all.
One thing I noticed as we did our interviews in Kenosha was just how many people worked at American Motors with their family members, fathers and sons, aunts, uncles, nephews. I mean, even in some cases, 3 generations were working at the plant at the same time, or cousins, brothers, they carpool together. And so, when you are the largest employer in town, you're bound to get families working together to some extent, sometimes side by side, sometimes in completely different departments. And I think one of the more interesting stories that we weren't able to share, unfortunately, was that of Kathleen Watring Rader. Now, if you remember episode 1, we have Genevieve Watring, and that was her mother. And so Jen started working at American Motors in the 1950s. Then what I think is funny is she started out working in the office and then switched to working on the assembly line because the assembly line paid more money. Now, Kathleen did not work on the assembly line. She was primarily an office worker, but she shared some interesting stories with us about what the work environment was like in the 1970s. And one thing she pointed out that I thought was interesting was that AMC had special parking for employees that drove AMC or Jeep or Renault vehicles. But if you drove a competitor's car, well, you had to park farther away. Also, I thought it was interesting how they got their cars. She mentioned that she was able to buy a special off-lease executive car that was kind of a weird combination of options. So here's her story.
72, I got a Gremlin. In fact, we got it out of Detroit. It was an experimental car. That was back when they would allow you to buy some of their cars. They were either one of the big executive cars that was leased or whatever. It was 72 Gremlin, but it had 74 rear end in it, different windows. I wish I had it today. I'm sure it'd be worth a lot of money. And it was that green, I don't know, almost like frog color green, or lime green. And then I bought a Hornet hatchback when I got rid of that. I got that in about 78. And then I bought a Jeep out of Detroit. And then that was about it. Then we got Chryslers and whatever. So did everybody drive AMC cars or whatever? Not everybody, but mostly you did. And you couldn't park in the lot if you didn't have an AMC or Chrysler vehicle or whatever, which I agreed with. This is your bread and butter, and you're not driving their product.
One thing I'm particularly proud of our team for doing is finding so many stories from women who worked at American Motors, whether they were white-collar employees or worked in the factory. And I sometimes think, especially for younger people like me, it can be easy to be a little naive and think, oh, everything was so sexist back then. Women stayed home, men did the work, as if dual-income families were something that was invented in the 1990s. But if you look at the photographs, you look at the footage, there were a lot of women who worked at American Motors as far back as the 1950s. Now, I'm not saying it was a perfect 50-50 split between men and women, but they certainly were there. And I think a big part of that was that for a lot of families, they needed the money, and AMC was one of the best paying jobs in town. And so I think there were a lot of husbands and wives who probably looked at their bank account, looked at their pocketbooks, and looked at what AMC was paying and said, yeah, we both have to go to work. We can't afford not to. But just like families today, that presented a lot of challenges. And, work-life balance is nothing new. People were dealing with it back then too. And so I thought Kathleen was interesting in that she talked about some of the challenges of working at the plant, and do I quit to take care of my kids or do I keep my job? And so here's what she had to say.
I worked there until 1980. I started in 72, got married in 76. I had a daughter at the end of 76, Katie, and then went back to work. Then I had another daughter in 1980, And I had 8 years, and everybody's telling me, wow, you want to vest your pension, stay for that 10 years. I knew if I went back, I probably would have never quit because it was good money and it was good benefits. And I mean, I had 6 weeks vacation with all the holidays and everything. It was the first year you worked there, you had 1 week. Second year you worked there, you had 2 weeks. By the time you had 5 years in, you had like 4 or 5 weeks with all the holidays they gave you off. And so it was nice. But again, like my mother, I wanted to raise my family. And then I had a son a year later. What I should have done is stayed home with my kids at the beginning, and then once they hit school, went into American Motors or Chrysler or whatever. But because it was so good of money. But my husband started his business. He had an alignment shop in Kenosha, and then I started doing the books for him. But I'd bring the kids to school, and then I'd come in there, and he'd make all the money for the week, and I'd come in and spend it all. Pay all the bills.
Again, that was maybe outside the scope of what we were covering in our documentary, but it shows that, sometimes younger folks like me can be kind of arrogant and think that we're the only ones who have problems like that today. And I think families back in the 70s too were trying to figure out what's the best way to raise our kids and make a living and pay our bills. It's the age-old human thing. Everybody wants to do what's best for their family, and sometimes the choice is not always clear. Now, for the next person I'd like to focus on, we're going to have to rewind a little bit. This gentleman's name was Al Gabriel, and his story is interesting because he came to work at American Motors in 1958, which, if you remember from episode 1, AMC was booming then. I mean, the Rambler had taken off, sales were higher every month than the month before, and, the assembly line was just running full blast. And because of that, AMC was hiring. And so Al talked about coming from Peshtigo, Wisconsin, which is a town I'd never even heard of, and coming down to Kenosha with some of his buddies looking for work because they heard AMC was hiring. And, that's how bad they wanted jobs back then. So he talks about some of the challenges that happened when AMC went on a hiring spree.
They were hiring from everywhere at that point, a lot of people from the South, and it was very difficult to find a place to stay. We ended up staying at a downtown hotel for a few days, and then we stayed in a garage that was converted into a room behind the motel till we finally got an apartment that was suitable for 4 of us. So it was, you're right, they hired a lot of people and it started to boom.
Now, do you remember anything at all about George Romney, the CEO, would sometimes come to the plant and give speeches or motivate?
Yes, I remember George Romney. We even had several years, we had a plant-wide outing or meeting up at County Stadium. And he came and emceed that or spoke, and we had several of those. They always give away a car. Just one for the crowd, but I mean, at least they gave away one.
Now, another one of Al's stories involves when he was working on the assembly line while Javelins and AMXs were being built. And if you watched episode 2 of our documentary, you remember that in 1969, AMC gave a hot pink AMX to Playboy magazine's Playmate of the Year. And that was not a color that was available on standard AMXs. That was a special one-off job. But it turns out Al actually remembers that very car.
Remember the one car that went down the line? Somebody looked it up about, I don't know, this last winter we talked about that. I said, remember when Hugh Hefner ordered an AMX? It was pink. Came down the line, and I was still on hourly back then. That was, kind of a unique situation. There was just one pink AMX coming down the line, and it was for Hugh Hefner, Playboy car.
Now, personally, I think the whole Playboy magazine thing is kind of silly. However, I do realize that this car has an important place in AMC history, and it does survive till today. It's even been restored. But I think what's more interesting to me is the fact that there was just this one single car painted that color, and I actually met a guy who can remember seeing that very car go down the assembly line. That is pretty cool. Another gentleman we interviewed who unfortunately did not make it into the final production was Bobby Allen, and he worked at AMC in the 1970s until the early 80s. And he was interesting because we talked about what it was like to work on specific cars on the assembly line. And, ambassadors, matadors, even javelins and Hornets are pretty conventional vehicles, front engine, rear wheel drive, whatever. But the Pacer was a little bit more difficult to work on. It was a weird shape. The packaging was bizarre because they had to shoehorn that engine in. And so Bobby talked about what it was like working on Pacers on the assembly line after years of working on other cars.
The Pacer, it was just a pain to work on. The way the motor was set back and everything, and the brake systems on it. When they first started the new brake systems in there with the big machines, they came in there. They had all kind of troubles with them and with leaks, it wouldn't mount good on the master cylinder. And somebody in the pit, if they're working underneath of the car, that joker started leaking bad, they'd get sprayed with brake fluid a lot of times underneath. And we've had that happen a lot of times there. But they finally got it all worked out, on it and everything. They got it down pretty good, to what to do. But the Pacer was just a pain altogether. But it was a nice car. I liked the Pacer. Plenty of room on the inside. You could see all around you with all the glass and everything, But hot days, you could burn up in it. The air conditioning worked decent, with all them big windows in there. It was hard to cool it down. But other than that, I liked the Pacer too. It was odd looking. We always called him the egg. It looked like an egg coming down,
As you know from our documentary, all kinds of different people worked at American Motors. But one thing that struck me is that in hindsight, almost all of them were proud to have said they worked for AMC. I mean, yeah, you heard the stories about drinking and guys getting in trouble on the assembly line, and that kind of thing. But for the most part, these people were proud of the work they did and they wanted to do a good job. And I think this soundbite from Bobby kind of wraps it all up. It's if he could speak for all of them, I think a lot of them felt this way.
Most people that worked at AMC was proud to work there. You'd get a few that didn't really care or give a hoot, but I'm going to say 99% of the people that worked there was proud to work there. My dad, he was proud to work there. All my uncle, all my family was proud to work there, and I was proud to work there. It was a good place to work. You made a good living there.
Now, that's it for all the people who were former AMC employees that we interviewed who didn't make it into the documentary. But we still have two more people that I think deserve recognition. First off is Cynthia Nelson, who is a staff member at the Kenosha History Center. And sadly, we weren't able to include her in the documentary because, again, we were just cramming so much information and we had so many other stories from people in Kenosha that we just didn't have room to include her. But Cynthia is a great lady. So much fun to talk to, super knowledgeable just about the city of Kenosha, going back way before, AMC or cars even existed. But I would like to play this one clip from her that really stood out to me as really interesting. She talks about, after World War II, lots of immigrants are coming to America. They're leaving Europe for more opportunities in the US and particularly in Kenosha. And she talks about something interesting that Nash Motors did as it was getting this influx of immigrant workers.
Nash was a wonderful patron to the community because the way the company was at that time, before it did become American Motors, they provided English classes for their employees. They provided opportunities for them to get their high school educations or educations with night schools, day school programs. They asked for our school district to offer evening, technical school programs for those people who may not have mastered English. So when you come into an industrial job as an immigrant, you have to master the language because you may have paperwork you need to do. You have to fill out a form for paychecks. So it started there and it passed on. You'll hear about people coming here post-World War II, so you're coming into not quite the American Motors time period, but they're coming from a legacy of destruction in Europe, and they have these opportunities for jobs. So AMC, that's when the auto industry comes into its height as an industry. So there's all those opportunities for people to just become part of the American culture, learning your language, learning your customs, just those things that Americans have. So when your coworker might be a person who's been here for multiple generations, or maybe they're only one generation removed. One thing about Wisconsin you'll discover is when people ask you who you are, many times they're tied to their immigrant roots yet. They'll identify themselves as an ethnicity as much as a American, a Wisconsinite, or a Kenoshan. So that industry gave them opportunities to not starve.
Now, the last individual I'd like to recognize is Pat Goss, who you might remember from the TV show MotorWeek. He was the show's master technician, genius mechanic, guy who did the car maintenance and advice segments, who sadly passed away in 2022. Now, I was fortunate that when I was a staff member at MotorWeek, I actually had the chance to interview Pat for the last independent automaker. Sadly, we didn't end up using his interview because we had so much other information and his answers were very technical, and we kind of decided they were maybe too technical for the average audience. We couldn't spend too much time explaining the inner details of things. But I know that real car nuts like you and me probably love that kind of stuff. So that's why I'm so excited to share some of that here on the podcast. And, Pat was so great at understanding how things work and then transferring that understanding to the viewer. He was really at his heart a teacher. I don't know if he ever worked in a classroom, but through television, he was able to teach people about cars. And so I asked him to explain what made certain things about AMC's so good. And one of those things was AMC's, 7-main bearing inline 6 engine, what was the 232 and the 258, and of course the legendary Jeep 4.0. I asked him to explain what made the AMC inline 6 such a great motor.
Well, of course, that was nothing new. It was just new to AMC. Some of the old cars, the Hudsons and so on, had done a similar thing. The more that you can support the crankshaft, the less flexing you have, the longer the engine is going to last. Bearings last longer because they don't have twisting forces on them and so on. So that combined with some really good engineering that evolved over the years made those engines, back in the day when reaching 100,000 miles was a real milestone, made those engines typically capable of 200 or more thousand miles.
We'll talk about the Jeep version that then came later. I mean, the engine almost got a second wind in the 80s when it became more of an SUV and truck engine. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, that basic design from AMC, when we got into Jeep, they took the design, refined it a little bit, made it idle a little better and do various things to it. The only thing they couldn't do, never managed with that engine, they couldn't get the emissions really low on it, and they couldn't get fuel economy. But it made Jeep Cherokee and Wrangler and so on, made them very impressive vehicles because it was a torquey engine and you couldn't kill it.
And that torque and reliability are the things the off-road community loves.
When we're talking about off-road and trucking and so on, we want to get things moving, and we want them to move without a lot of jerkiness and so on. If you're off-road, if you don't have enough torque and you got to rev the engine real high and feather the clutch and a whole bunch of other stuff to try to get it moving, you're very apt to break traction. And once that happens, you may be sitting there stuck. Well, with the extra torque that the inline 6 had, you had the advantage of gentle throttle and the ability to pull away smoothly.
Another technical feature that I asked Pat Goss to explain was the four-wheel drive system in the AMC Eagle. And of course, if you watch episode 5 of our documentary, we talk about Roy Lunn and, the viscous coupling and how that was such a big deal. And it made the AMC Eagle, a really revolutionary vehicle. Well, here's what Pat had to say about that.
Well, viscous couplings, and I had an Eagle. I bought it at the auction and was going to sell it, and actually fell in love with it and drove it for several years, even though it was old and kind of clunky. but it was a really nice vehicle. But viscous couplings, to use an expanding liquid to push clutches together, that was a pretty radical deal. You know, up until that point, you either had to push a lever or something to compress a diaphragm clutch, or do something to manually move the clutch discs into when they're together, or to release them.
You know, watching those clips of Pat Goss make me sad that he's no longer with us. And, you know, it breaks my heart that multiple people we've interviewed since we started this project have since passed away. And that's really hard because you get attached to these people. You get their stories and their memories, and you spend so much time watching this footage as we assembled this piece. To know that they're no longer with us is really hard. But I can at least take a little bit of comfort in knowing that we were able to save their stories and preserve them. And whether they made it into the documentary or not, all of them provided research and information that helped us as we wrote and edited this project. And now we get to share their stories with the world. And I'm so glad that I was able to do this podcast episode to highlight some of these people so that nobody was left out. And I'm also happy that our team is going to hold on to these interviews to preserve them, the full raw interviews, some of which are multiple hours long, so that decades from now, people can learn about AMC, not just through our documentary, but also through these interviews, which I hope will provide a valuable research tool for future generations. I'm so glad you joined me for this special podcast with some of our behind the scenes clips. Be sure and stay tuned because we've got more podcasts coming. And until then, thank you very much for watching. The Last Independent Automaker Podcast was sponsored in part by Visit Detroit, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Motor City's National Heritage Area, and by the over 375 individuals and organizations who donated to this project. Thank you.